Well, A Course in Miracles says, God is but love, and therefore so am I. So love, you know, you say you love flowers and you cut them. You say that you love animals and you eat them. You say you love me, so now I'm scared. So that's a quote. And so we get to explore what love is. And according to the science of mind, Ernest Holmes says, love is the self-givingness of spirit through the desire of life in terms of creation. And the New Testament says, he that loveth not knoweth not God. So love someone is to give your attention to them. The Course goes on to say, into his presence would I enter now. So we're moving into God's presence each time we choose to really listen to another. Sometimes I put other in quotes as if there was more than one of us here. So when we meet someone looking at the life they hold, we tend to listen and receive. When we meet someone and we're not paying attention to the life that they hold, then we're not really listening to them. A father who was putting his son to bed, and he would read to him at night, and then they would do their prayer. And the son would say, God bless Daddy, and God bless Grandma. Goodbye, Grandpa. Next day, Grandpa died. And, the father was a little freaked out. He didn't want to say anything to his wife, because it was her father. Her mother was still alive with him. And so the next night, or a few months later, the father was with the son, and he was doing his prayer again. And he says, good night, Mommy. Good night, Daddy. Goodbye, Grandma. And the next day, Grandma transitioned. She was no longer on the earthly realm. Passed, and the little boy was praying, good night, Mom. Goodbye, Daddy. Daddy, like, goodbye, Daddy. Are you sure? And the little boy says, yeah. So, of course, he's freaking out, right? And so the next day, he just goes off to work. He locks himself in his office. He doesn't take any calls. He cancels all of his meetings. He stays in his office the whole day. When it's 5 o'clock, he still stays in the office. And, he stayed there until it was after midnight. And finally, he was relieved, and he was going home. And he got home, and my wife said, how you doing? And he says, oh, I had just a really, really rough day. And she said, you had a rough day. The first thing that happened was the milkman died on the front step. So, obviously, but he wasn't listening enough to know what was really going on with his family. But, a lot of times when we're interacting with each other, we're kind of coming close to what matters. We get enough according to the level of our interest. And what I'm saying is it's according to the level of our loving, because we tend to listen more when we're really engaged in the life energy the person is presenting to us. And so when we listen and receive, it's because it's one thing to hear and another thing to receive it into our hearts and into our bodies. Somebody just got the joke. Okay, so getting our hearts and into our bodies. I don't know how it's been for you these last few weeks, but for me, a lot of stuff has been getting into my body. A lot of trauma has been getting into my body. A lot of us are learning more and more about history, and finding out what has gone on and what caused a lot of the agitation that we've been seeing playing out in the streets. And it's not something that's out of the blue. It's something that is really real in terms of an accumulated trauma. And so it's important for us to know that when George Floyd said, listen, come on, the car, let's get in the car, while he had his knee on his neck. Come on, man, get in the car. So imagine what that's like to compute that. He was computing, I can't get in the car because I'm on the ground. I can't get in the car because you're on my neck. I can't get in the car because I can't move right now. Now what Chauvin was listening for was the cessation of George Floyd's breath. But what George Floyd was listening for was an opportunity for Chauvin to hear him saying, I can't breathe. And so what we hear in our conversations with each other is based on, a lot of times, what our intentions are. So many of the things that I've been experiencing as of late have been jarring. It may be the same for you if you're paying attention, if you're listening. But so many stories are coming to light to the degree that I've noticed fear and caution in a way that I thought I had cast off from my mode of thinking, right? Just because I've been in New Thought for a few decades plus and been studying A Course in Miracles for years and years, and teaching the Course and teaching other spiritual principles, doesn't mean that I didn't have a body of experience before then. And it doesn't mean that I haven't had a body of experiences since then that have been mean or harmful or cruel. But the beauty of being in spiritual discipline is that you can hear your thoughts and then you can isolate them from the truth. So in his book, 7,000 Ways to Listen, Mark Nepo suggests that having this conversation with everything, that includes a conversation with the birds, with the squirrels, with whatever life energy that there is, having a conversation with everything is partnership. But when we have no interest in partnership, no interest in listening, then we start to do damage to our environment, to animals, to all of these different things. And what's ours to do as students of the Course and as spiritual beings is to connect the dots, see the ways in which we are connected, find the ways that we have similarities, find the things that we have in common. Notice the things that are bringing your beloved one joy. Notice the things that are bringing your family sorrow, right? It's a kind of mindfulness that Jack Kornfield asks us to look at when he asks us to bring our intention into the conversation. He says, intention is the seed that creates our future. So what are you intending, right? Because this is nothing much more than an intention to stay present, right? So this weekend, we're celebrating Pride. You know, in the 1960s and earlier, it was not a welcoming time for LGBT people, you know, and LGBTQIA people were flocking to gay bars where they could express themselves openly, ourselves openly, because I fit into this paradigm of LGBTQIA. So the New York State Liquor Authority penalized and shut down establishments that served alcohol to known or suspected LGBT people. And they were saying that the gathering of homosexuals in and of itself was disorderly. So then they weren't even allowing them to drink except for some of the bars because the mafia was still making money. They've been making money since Prohibition. So they were still providing liquor to some of the bars. But it wasn't until 1966 when the regulations were overturned that the LGBTQ community could actually be served alcohol. Fat Tony actually owned the Stonewall Inn. I mean, in terms of his ability to keep it open, his ability to keep it stocked with liquor. So he was also the same guy who controls concrete workers. He's the same person who provided all that concrete that built Trump Tower, even though the 45th president is saying that he doesn't know Fat Tony, right? But anyway, this is controlling the police precinct. He was paying them like $1,200 a week for the officers to look the other way at Stonewall. Well, you know, he was still taking advantage of the LGBTQ community because the drinks were watered down, the prices were high, and, you know, people were just paying whatever they needed to pay in order to, somebody put, Fat Tony's an equal opportunity employer, but here's where that changes. Because the LGBTQ community was like, you know, we don't like this situation the way it is. And they started, you know, kind of like pushing back, you know, and Big Tony, Fat Tony wasn't the only one. Vito Genovese, he controlled Greenwich Village, where Streisand made her first public appearance at the Lion Gay Bar. But the LGBTQ community was complaining because, you know, watered down drinks, high prices, but no one was listening. And the Gay Rights Alliance and the Gay Liberation Front got together, and they, you know, they were trying to make things change. And so 1:20 a.m. on June 28, 1969, the officers entered the Stonewall Inn and they started arresting people. And they were forced to wait outside the bar handcuffed. And this woman who was already handcuffed was getting hit over the head. And so she pleaded for everybody, do something. So people started throwing pennies. They started throwing any kind of objects at the police officers. And then the crowd started reaching hundreds. And then 10 police officers were barricading themselves inside of the Stonewall Inn. And then the crowd set fire to the barricade. Well, you know, the fire department came and put them out, and the officers left there alive. But they still protested for 6 days. So the movement knew that we needed to be louder and visible. So nothing was going to change if they continued being passive. So there was a proposal for a march to be held 1 year after this raid happened. It became a resolution at the Eastern Regional Conference of the Homophile Organizations that a march be held in New York with no dress regulations and no age, which is why you see the wildest things during Pride Weekend, right? So Brenda Howard was one of the key planners, and she also had the idea to turn the festivities into a week-long celebration. Now, why are they calling it Gay Pride? Because people were repressed. People were conflicted internally, and they didn't know how to come out. Today, many white people today won't come out about their feelings when they want to defend Black people and other persons of color, you know? So it's important for us to listen, because when we're listening, we are totally in touch with each other. Pete Scanlon was telling a story about when he was in a company, there was this dinner going on, and there were these guys talking, sitting around talking, and this one man was about to start this story, and Pete knew that it was about to be a racial joke. And he said, look, I'm not feeling comfortable with this because I think this is heading to a racist joke. So either I'm gonna leave or you're not gonna tell this story. And so the rest of the evening was very uncomfortable. And so Pete started talking about white solidarity. because if you keep quiet, if you don't respond to things that are racist, that there's a social code that if you remain in solidarity, if you remain in white privilege, you never embarrass each other by pointing out prejudice. And it protects the whiteness and it protects white advantage. And he says another thing that's called white social capital. It's what you get. You're an insider, you get included, you're a team player, you're considered fun, you're included in business opportunities, you're included in social settings. You accrue white capital by going along. And so people become complicit, and they know that they're going to be penalized if they say something. So silence, as safe as it may appear, is not benign, because everything is continuing that always was. So it's important for us to listen to the calls, listen to what's happening. Blacks have been lynched for centuries and murdered, and this has been going on for a very long time. And the monuments that have been coming down were not really celebrations from the Civil War. There were 2 spikes when a lot of these Confederate monuments were constructed. There was a lot of Black wealth back in the end of the 18th century, so there was Reconstruction after the Civil War. There was over 2,000 Black elected officials in America, and businesses were owned by Blacks that were doing well. So when the president came in and got elected and he withdrew the troops, the 125 Black voters in 1876 went down to 5,000 Black registered voters in 1878. In just 2 years, 120,000 people lost their ability to vote one way or another. And the Confederate flag wasn't really around much until 1948, when Strom Thurmond brought it back with the Dixiecrat Party, that they called themselves the States' Rights Democratic Party. And it basically stood for segregation in America. And there's actually documents that say the Confederate flag means segregation. So the next surge came after they bombed the church with the 4 little Black girls being killed around that time, And so right after King was killed, a couple of years later, another Confederate monument went up. So it was more strategic than a commemoration of culture, right? And so the intention was to protect white privilege. So we have to listen to what's going on. We have to pay attention, because a lot of codes are happening that we're not aware of. And so it's important for us to really be present with how we're carrying our shadows. In Living A Course in Miracles, Marianne Williamson quotes Dr. Carl Jung. He says, everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. At all costs, it forms an unconscious snag thwarting our most well-meant intentions. Okay? So your ego is smarter than you are. This is Jed McKenna. Your ego is smarter than you are, way smarter. And if you don't recognize that and respect it, you stand very little chance against it. So we know in the Course, we're always looking at, is the ego leading this thought, or is love leading this thought? And so it's important for us to listen to what's really going on. It was a man who walked in a bar with this briefcase, and he looked like he had a really rough day. And He opens the briefcase up, and there's this 12-inch man who's playing the piano inside of his briefcase. And, you know, he just orders his drink, and the bartender was about to make a comment about this 12-inch man playing this piano when somebody said, "Come outside quick. There's a genie outside the door who's granting people wishes," right? So the bartender goes rushing out, and then the little guy, the 12-inch guy, is playing the piano. He comes back, and he's really immediately thereafter followed by tons and tons of ducks. He's like, "Oh my God. I said I wanted $100 million, not 100 million ducks." And the guy with the 12-inch pianist says, "Do you think I asked for a 12-inch pianist?" It's interesting. Once you get that, let me know. It's interesting. It's interesting.
I got it.
Interesting to know when you're really listening and when you're not, because the consequences can be very, very, very stressful and diminishing and destructive. So my invitation is to be still and listen to your true self. Be still. If you resist stillness, you will be quieted. Mark Nepo tells a story of a person who would not be still, and he was boiling some water, and it spilled on him, and so he had to be still for a couple of months. I guess it was a pretty intense burn. And as he was being still, he discovered he was a painter, and he started creating and became a fabulous painter. He became a great artist. So once you are still, get in touch with your magnificence, your genius, and yes, your shadows. Because if you are not in touch with your shadows will run your life. And you know, the shadows are not our greatest asset. Deepak Chopra tells us light, all existence is light. So I invite you to shine your light, not just for yourself, but for all of us. Namaste.
Namaste. Thank you.
Namaste. That was amazing.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
So, Kathy, you ready to sing a song for us?
I sure am. You with sad eyes, don't be discouraged. No, I realize sometimes it's hard to take courage. In a world full of people, you can lose sight of it all, and the darkness inside you make you feel so small. But I see your true colors shining through. I see your true colors. That's why I love you. So don't be afraid. Just let them show true colors. True colors are beautiful like a rainbow. Show me a smile then, don't be unhappy. You know I can't remember when last saw you laughing. If this world makes you crazy and you how you can bear, you can just call me baby. Yeah, you know I'll be there, 'cause I see your true colors shining through. Yeah, I see your true colors. That's why I love you. So don't be afraid. Just let them show true colors. True colors. True colors come shining through. Yeah, I see your true colors. That's why I love you. So don't be afraid. Just let them show. Ooh, let them show true colors, true colors, beautiful like a rainbow. Thanks, everybody.
You.